Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It looks like a very exciting panel with a lot of distinguished commentators and analysts and academics on affairs related to Islam and democracy. Danish did an excellent job of describing how the liberal intelligentsia had shaped an environment in which democracy and human rights were subverted in the March presidential election in Egypt. I'm going to build on that and try to assess what the implications of that election are for stability and Sisi's likely future within Egypt. As a disclaimer, this presentation is derived from my recent foreign affairs article, which Dalia mentioned, and I co-drafted with Amy Hawthorne, my colleague at POMED, entitled Egypt's Sham Election, that ran in Foreign Affairs magazine in last month in March. So I'm going to make 5 points about the election and what it probably means for the stability of the regime and President Sisi in particular. The first point is that the ultimate outcome of the March presidential election in Egypt, in which Sisi won re-election with over 97% of the vote, does not provide a meaningful indicator of popular support for his candidacy. Indeed, the election has been described accurately as a farce in which Sisi systematically eliminated all credible competitors to his re-election. We saw any number of candidates, both military and civilian, put under heavy pressure by the security services. Others were actually detained or arrested. The only opponent who made it into the election was a man named Mustafa Musa, who was an avowed supporter of Sisi's re-election. As little as 24 hours before he announced his candidacy at the last possible moment, he considered himself, or he labeled himself, the chair of Sisi's re-election campaign. And his Facebook page actually contained some graphics that supported Sisi's re-election. This is also an individual who is long suspected of having ties to the intelligence services. He likely played a role under the Mubarak regime in dividing the Al-Rad party, nor at the behest of the security services. The political bankruptcy of this election was reflected in the lack of public enthusiasm. There was a reported turnout of 41%, which was lower than the 47% in 2014 and about 50% in 2012. However, the likely turnout was probably much lower. Most of the polling stations at the conclusion of the second of 3 days of balloting indicated they had turnout of around 20%. It's highly unlikely that 25% of the Egyptian electorate turned out in a single day. So in all likelihood, the turnout was probably less than 30%, which marks a major decline in participation in Egyptian presidential elections, and again reveals that this election very much was a farce. It was a sham. It didn't provide a meaningful outlet for Egyptians to express their political preferences. The second point is, although the outcome of the election itself was not a meaningful indicator of Sisi's public standing, the way in which he managed it does provide some important hints about his position within the country and how he views his ability to control the country moving forward. In particular, he ratcheted up repression and angrily and ruthlessly quashed military-linked candidates. This demonstrates the degree to which his power is dependent on the military's continued loyalty, or at least its acquiescence. What we saw is at least 2 significant military competitors in Ahmed Shafiq, who was referenced in Danish's presentation, and Sami Anan, the former Armed Forces Chief of Staff, stepped forward. They were both pushed out of the election. In the case of Shafiq, he was detained in a hotel in Cairo for a number of days, and pressure was put on his daughters, who were essentially hostages in Abu Dhabi. So there was a deliberate attempt to move him out of the campaign. When Sami Anan, the Chief of Staff, announced his candidacy, he was almost instantaneously arrested. He still remains in military prison, although some of the charges have been dropped, and it's unclear how much longer he's actually going to remain in prison. But what we saw with these military candidates is this was the first instance of discontent within the Egyptian military turning into outright dissent, where you had senior members of the armed forces, retired or active, actually posing a challenge to Sisi's control and power. We saw this discontent going back several years. In fact, as early as 2014, we saw purges in which military officers from junior to senior were reportedly pushed out because of their supposed opposition to President Sisi. We saw opposition within the military to the controversial deal Sisi negotiated with Saudi Arabia to turn over 2 Red Sea islands. And in fact, in this regard, both the defense minister, Sedki Sobhi, and the, at the time, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Mahmoud Higazi, who is a family relation of Sisi's, are known to have opposed that decision. And even more recently, before the elections, Higazi, who I mentioned is a familial relation, was forced out of his position and placed under house arrest, reportedly because he disagreed with Sisi's management of the security situation. So there was clearly some level of discontent within the Egyptian military. With this election, it came out into the open, and Sisi's reaction was furious. On January 31st, he attended a ceremony inaugurating the Zohr gas field in northern, off the coast of Egypt. The speech took place in northern Egypt, and he angrily denounced opposition to him within the country, and staring menacingly at the defense minister, said he would not allow another scenario like 2011 to repeat itself. So it was clear that he was spooked by what was taking place, and that he suspected that elements of the military were responsible for challenges to his position. The third point is that moving forward, because Sisi is so dependent on the military, his survival will likely depend on whether he can keep the perceived cost of his removal to be higher than the perceived cost of his remaining in power. Some of the costs of removal are primarily revolve around the uncertainty associated with trying to find another candidate, a perceived lack of alternatives, although the emergence of Annan and Shafiq put the lie to that to some degree. Some of the costs of continuing to support Sisi is that the military's reputation could suffer damage if they're perceived as being so out of step with the public at large. The military in Egypt is a risk-averse institution. They're very conservative, and they're probably going to be reluctant to act against one of their own. But as we saw in 2011, there are circumstances in which the military could be compelled to take action. Above all else, the military fears chaos, and if they determine that Sisi is either contributing to disorder in the country or he cannot prevent the emergence of disorder, his position could become untenable. The fourth point concerns what specific conditions might lead the military to take action against Sisi. And it's very possible that Sisi's position will hinge on the military's view of his management of 2 challenges: 1, the economy, and 2, the security situation in the country. Should either issue threaten to strain military cohesion in particular, by which I mean the armed forces' unity of purpose and respect for the authority of the senior leadership, senior leaders may be even more inclined to take drastic steps of forcing Sisi out. It's no secret that the Egyptian economy is in difficult straits. Sisi has undertaken a number of reforms at the recommendation of the IMF to stabilize the economy, but it remains to be seen whether these measures that are probably producing some degree of aggregate economic growth can be translated into better living conditions for most Egyptians. And if he's unable to improve the living conditions of most Egyptians, we could very well see mass protests or civil disobedience that would put pressure on the military to take action. It's important to recognize that in Egypt now, you have over 30% of the population living in poverty. The official unemployment rate is below 12%. However, the estimate is that youth unemployment is 33%. Inflation remains high. It's over 13%. It was as high as over 30% in recent months. The situation is particularly troublesome, and the Egyptians who are least capable of withstanding these circumstances are the ones who have suffered the most. If Sisi is unable to reverse this trend, if he's unable to deliver inclusive economic growth, the military may be forced to come out in the event of some type of popular disturbances. Second, regarding the security situation, again, it's well known that the situation in the Sinai is particularly particularly dodgy, and we have this ongoing Egyptian military campaign there. It's unclear what progress it's made, although if you're looking at past instances of Egyptian military deployments to Sinai, any progress has been relatively short-lived. What's important to understand is that what takes place within the Sinai is probably not the most important security challenge for Sisi. To some degree, if he can merely contain what's taking place within the peninsula, it's probably not going to pose a threat to his regime. However, if this security threat metastasizes and emerges in the Nile Delta in the Egyptian heartland, that could potentially pose a threat to his standing. The military, it has to be recognized, above all else, is responsible for providing security. It is their raison d'etre. And if it's perceived that the Sisi regime is not capable of providing that security, if there are major terrorist attacks in Cairo, in Nile Delta cities, like we've seen recently, attacks on Coptic Christian churches, we saw a major attack at a mosque in the Sinai, but if that takes place west of the Suez Canal, that could lead to a perception within the Egyptian military that Sisi's become a liability, and they may have to act out from that point. And what's perhaps most concerning is that beyond the threat posed by ISIS, we've also seen additional organizations emerge that pose a threat, many of which are believed to be populated by ex-members of the Muslim Brotherhood who left the organization primarily because they disagreed with the group's peaceful, gradualist approach to politics and sought a more violent means of achieving the political objectives that they continued to share with many other organizations. So it'll be important to watch out, either by protests forcing the military to come out or some type of palace coup. There is the risk that there could be some type of threat to Sisi emanating from the military. The final point I'll make is that in terms of the most immediate threats and the playing field that we're turning to with the elections past us, a lot of attention has been focused on constitutional amendments, that Sisi is going to try to change the Constitution either to extend his term, remove term limits, or strengthen his power. And I agree that's going to be an important indicator of his support. If he can push through those changes, it probably suggests a degree of military cohesion that will put him in good stead. However, even if he moves past that challenge, even if he's successful in delivering those constitutional amendments, we have to watch out for potential externalities over which, by definition, Sisi has little control, such as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam or a global economic downturn, either of which could destabilize Egypt and undermine Sisi's standing within the country. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam could begin filling soon, and there are some estimates that it could reduce water flow to Egypt by as much as 25%. And Egypt gets roughly 50% of its electricity from hydropower. So this would have consequences not just for drinking water and for agriculture, but potentially for economic activity throughout the country. That's something to watch, and there's growing concern that the Egyptians are not going to be able to prevent it from moving forward. The foreign minister issued a rather truculent statement recently saying that Egypt is willing to resort to all means in order to protect its water share. So that's an alarming development. In terms of the economy, the global economy has been doing fairly well. It's not spectacular, but it's chugging along. If there were another global recession like we saw at the end of the last decade, Egypt is particularly vulnerable to shocks in the global economic framework. So even if Sisi plays the economy perfectly, even if he begins to deliver improvements to living conditions, a global economic downturn can undercut everything he's achieved and plunge the country into chaos. So what this points out is not only is Sisi perhaps undermining his position by unforced errors, but there are also things beyond his control, these externalities that could potentially jeopardize his ability to stay on. In short, Sisi's ability to serve a term commensurate with that of Mubarak seems unlikely at this point, but we'll ultimately only figure that out depending on how he and the degree to which he consolidates the regime. Thank you.